Hygiene and Safety Week 10. What we're going to do first is we're going to recap our midterm exam. So I'll go through the exam with you question by question, just giving you a bit of an idea of the answers. And then after that, we'll carry on with our HACCP conversation in terms of the different steps. We'll go a little bit more in depth with each of those steps. So the first thing we're going to do is our recap. So let me bring up the test here real quick. All right, so if you scroll along, which of the following jewelry is often allowed to be worn in the kitchen? And your only possible answer would have been C, wedding ring. Watches and other things like that are not allowed to be worn in a kitchen. Only a wedding ring is the common thing that's allowed to be worn. Kitchen shoes must be E, slip resistant. 3, it's important for your chef knife to be kept clean, sharp, carried safely, or D, all of the above? D, all of the above. Workplace walkways should be kept clean and organized, painted and colorful, full of cats, and full of empty boxes. A, clean and organized. Always clean and organized. When there is a spill in the kitchen, it should be A, left for someone else to clean up, B, cleaned up right away, C, covered with newspaper, D, I will never spill anything. Yeah, right. B, cleaned up right away. Before cleaning a piece of equipment, it is important to A, make sure it's unplugged, B, make sure it's on, C, make sure your hair is looking good, or D, all of the above. Obviously, A, make sure it is unplugged. When receiving food deliveries in a food service operation, it is important to A, weigh all the items, B, check the quality of the items, C, make sure there are no damaged items, or D, all of the above. The correct answer, of course, is D. You check all 3 of these things. Number 8, dry storage food should be kept A, 15 meters off the ground, B, in the fridge, C, in open containers to keep them dry, D, none of the above. D, none of the above. How many steps are there in a HACCP plan? C, 7. If you are carrying a knife in the kitchen, and if you are carrying a knife in a kitchen, it's important to A, run very fast with the knife straight out, B, carry the knife by your side with the blade pointing down, C, carry the knife by the blade with the handle pointed out, or D, carry the knife pointed outward so you can cause max pain. The answer there would be, of course, B, carry the knife by your side with the blade pointing down. Number 11, if a knife falls, you should A, try to catch it, B, try to kick it, C, back away from it, D, none of the above. The correct answer would be C, back away from it. As soon as the knife falls, you want to step back to make sure that it doesn't stab you in the leg or bounce up and cut you. True or false? A dull knife is a safe knife. False. It is important to communicate in the kitchen. True. The color of a chef jacket is a health regulation. False. Having a fire escape plan is not that important. False. Lag time is the period in which bacteria grows. False. It is important to shower or bathe daily. True. Food service gloves are made for single use. True. The best way to thaw frozen food is in warm water. False. It is not important to label and date food in the fridges. False. When in a kitchen, remember to run, not walk. False. It is normal to chew gum while working in the kitchen. False. Hand washing should only be done after touching PHS. Again, false. Fill in the blanks. Always wash your hands after smoking, eating, touching your face, and using the bathroom. When touching foods that are ready to eat, it is important to wear food service gloves. When using a knife, always cut on a cutting board. If there is an injury or incident at work, you should always fill out an accident or injury report form. List the 6 food groups in order of how they should be stored in the fridge. On the top, ready to eat. Underneath that, fruits and vegetables. Underneath that, raw seafood. Underneath that, raw meats. Underneath that, ground meats. On the bottom, raw poultry. Easily alert others in the kitchen when walking behind them by saying sharp or hot. These are two words that we use to easily alert somebody right away that behind them is a dangerous object. Matching items here. Green cutting board would be E, fruit vegetables. Black cutting board. C, ready to eat. Blue cutting board. D, fish seafood. Red cutting board. F, raw meats. Yellow cutting board. A, raw poultry. White cutting board. B, dairy products. What does TCS stand for? TCS stands for time and temperature as a control for safety. Please explain what the food danger zone is. So to get full points on this, you would have had to have touched on what is the food danger zone. And this would be the danger zone, the food temperature range between 40 and 140, in which bacteria multiplies exponentially. The reason we have the food danger zone is so that we know how to keep food safe during the processing phase, by keeping it for a minimum amount of time in the food danger zone. What does PHS stand for? Potentially hazardous foods. What are the two cooling methods? There's one-stage cooling method when we go from 140 or above to below 40 in 4 hours. Two-stage cooling method means that we go from 140 to 70 within 2 hours, and from 70 to 40 within 4 hours. Number 35, what does FIFO stand for and why is it important? FIFO stands for first in, first out. It's important because it's a system of rotating new stock with old stock so that we ensure that we use the old stock first and we don't serve spoiled stock to customers, thus causing them to get sick, or we don't waste food stock that gets old and end up throwing it in the garbage, which leads to a high cost. What's the basic concept about TCS? So as I mentioned before, TCS stands for time and temperature as a control for safety. What that means is that we either keep food under temperature control, being 4 or below, or 140 and above if you're hot holding or cold holding. Once we are unable to keep food temperature control, it then moves into time control with a cumulative total of 4 hours given to food out of temperature control. What are the 7 steps of HACCP? Step number 1, perform a hazard analysis. Step number 2, define critical control points. Step number 3, set critical limits. Number 4, set up the monitoring requirements. Step number 5, define corrective actions. Step number 6, I'm having a blank here. Perform HACCP validation, meaning run through the system to make sure it works. And step number 7, set up your record keeping procedures, because if you don't keep records of all of your food safety material, there's no point in having a HACCP plan. What is MIT and what is the concept behind it? Why is it important? MIT is the minimum internal cooking temperature, or minimum internal temperature, that we have to cook food to for a specified certain amount of time in order to make sure that we've effectively killed potential bacteria within that product. It's important because if we don't maintain or reach a minimum cooking temperature, we could serve contaminated food to a customer, causing a variety of different foodborne illnesses. For example, when we cook poultry, we cook it to 165 degrees Fahrenheit for a minimum of 15 seconds. Name 6 PHF foods. This would include raw meat, raw poultry, raw seafood, unpasteurized dairy products and cheeses, heat-treated plant-based foods, soy products, sprouted greens, unprocessed garlic and oil. These would all be considered PHF foods. So that is your correct answers for your midterm exam. Again, for your final exam, we'll go through a review PowerPoint so you know what you have to study prior to your final exam. Okay? You can check through your e-learning and you'll be able to see right away the results of your midterm exam. Now, moving on, we're going to get back into our PowerPoint here. So what we're going to talk about today is a little more in-depth about each step of HACCP. as I just mentioned, HACCP has 7 main steps, and then within those 7 steps are certain things you have to do and certain things you have to analyze in order to make sure that you're defining and setting up a proper HACCP plan. So, first thing to do is to perform a hazard analysis. A hazard analysis aims at identifying all possible hazards associated with food production at all the stages of the process carried out in a catering business. So at any particular point in a restaurant or catering business or hotel or food service operation, you need to identify all the possible hazards that could affect or contaminate the food being processed. For example, chicken. At one stage in your restaurant, you might marinate a chicken breast. That stage is a process where a hazard could happen. The hazard could be salmonella, caused by leaving it out of the food danger zone or in the food danger zone too long. So that's a critical control point where you have to set up critical limits. So we have to identify all the possible hazards. So you have to be a very negative thinker on this one. You have to look at all the bad side of the negative things that could happen at this point. You're trying to assess what could happen, how it could happen, how often it could happen during the processing stage or any processing stage throughout your business. Once you determine the possible hazards, then you need to determine the possible effects of these hazards on the health of the consumer. So the person eating the food, what are the possible effects of the hazard of the health of the customer? Again, for example, if we have a chicken breast and it gets contaminated with salmonella poisoning or salmonella bacteria, the possible effects on the health of the consumer would be foodborne illness, possibly requiring hospitalization, possibly given enough, or if it was strong enough or potent enough, could cause death. So we have to define the hazards, then determine what are the effects of those hazards on somebody's health. Then after that, we need to evaluate the probability that this hazard will happen. So again, let's look at 2 different hazards. Salmonella in chicken. If we leave it out of the fridge, the possibility of that occurring is fairly high. A piece of metal getting into my chicken is fairly low if I don't have any metal in the processing area. So you have to evaluate, is this very likely to happen, or is it not that likely to happen? Then you have to look at the hazards and then the preventative measures. How can we stop this hazard from happening? In the case of the chicken, if we want to ensure that the salmonella bacteria doesn't affect the chicken, the control or the preventative measure would be to leave the chicken in the fridge up until the moment we're ready to marinate it. We remove it from the fridge, we marinate it quickly, we get it back into the fridge so that it stays under temperature control. The next thing we need to do is to identify the critical control points. And so these are the points that we have to be checked to preclude or minimize all the risk situation. Basically what this means is that a critical control point is where the controlling action is deemed necessary and effectively carried out. So in your restaurant or in your processing of food, you have different stages along the way. All right? And we'll call this the receiving stage, processing stage, cooking stage, and serving stage. Okay, and it all runs in one direction, from the back door of the restaurant to the consumer at the front. So at the receiving stage, the processing stage, and the cooking stage, you need to look at what hazards could occur here. You need to look at what the possible effects to health are of the hazards at any given stage. Then you need to determine the probability, how often could this happen, and the preventative measures that you're going to take in each stage. The critical control point is the moment or the point at each stage when the preventative measures or the correct good processing action is taken to make sure that the hazard is eliminated or minimized. Okay? For example, and again, I'll use chicken. This is a very good example check the temperature. Okay, that's one of our control points. We check to make sure the chicken is still under 4 degrees or 40 degrees in order to maintain temperature control. We also give a visual and a smell check. Okay, we also check the quality. Okay, we want to smell the chicken, make sure it doesn't smell bad. We also want to make sure that visually the chicken looks okay, there's no discoloration. And then we want to move it into the cool storeroom. Okay, so we want to move it to the cool storeroom or the fridge right away. In the processing stage, we want to make sure that we maintain TCS control over the chicken and we process it in a safe manner. Maintaining temperature control, not taking too much out of the fridge, checking the temperature regularly to make sure that it's still under temperature control. In the cooking phase, we need to make sure that we get our MIT correct. So we want to make sure that we reach our minimum temperature of 165 for 15 seconds. So these are all different critical control points along the way. The cooking point is when we have to check to make sure that our minimum temperature is reached so that we can effectively kill any bacteria that might be in that poultry. We also need to set critical limits. So again, when we talk about going through these different processes or different stages of cooking, for example, we've got our TCS, and we know that our critical limit is 4 hours cumulative for the chicken to be out of temperature control and in time control. So that is our critical limit. That is as long as we can go. In the cooking stage or even the processing stage, there could be a time where we have to pre-cook the chicken or a sauce, and then we have to cool it down. So we have to make sure that we follow the 1-stage or 2-stage cooling. Either we get it from 140 to 40 in 4 hours, or we get it from 140 to 70 in 2 hours, and 70 to 40 in 4 hours. We have to make sure that we get that, or else we have to then employ a corrective measure. So that is our critical limits. The critical limits are the extreme measures or the extreme limits that we're allowed to take food to that's still considered safe. Once we cross that limit, we're doing something that's unsafe and we have to get back on the safe path of food production. Then we have to set up monitoring requirements. So this is a way that we monitor to make sure that our system provides actual control and evidence of preventative measures or effective control of the critical control points. That we actually are able to manage and maintain food safety at each critical control point. Number 5, we have to define corrective actions. So as I mentioned before, with the critical limits, we have to set up corrective action, and the corrective action is a set of guidelines or a set of rules that we have to follow in order to make sure that our food is still produced safely. So for example, let me just get a whiteboard eraser. We don't have any, that's great. All right. So, as I mentioned, we have these different points in the processing stage. So let's say we have our processing stage here. And in this one, we're going to be making a sauce. Okay, maybe a meat sauce. So we have to cook this sauce until it reaches our minimum internal temperature of 165. Then we have to cool it down using 1-stage cooling, let's say. So after 4 hours, we realize that the sauce is still 60 degrees. Okay? This means that we have not reached our critical limit, which is 4 hours and below 40. After 4 hours, it's still 60, meaning we haven't reached our critical limit. So then we have to put in a corrective action. The corrective action, and this is our food safety chain here. So now we've gone off of our critical limit. Our corrective action would then be to heat up the sauce to 165 again for 15 seconds, and then start the cooling process again, and make sure that we can get to below 40 degrees in 4 hours. Our corrective action brings us back into our food safety chain or along our food safety path or our HACCP plan. So corrective action is any action or SOP that we take in order to bring us back into a food safety plan, okay, once we've deviated from that plan. So that is our defining our corrective actions. Once we've defined our corrective actions, then we have to do HACCP validation. What HACCP validation means is that, again, we have our different stages in the processing, okay? However many stages or control points you may have in a given process. And this is our food safety chain. So what we want to do is go from start to finish to make sure the system works, to make sure that all of our hazards, all of our control points, all of our critical limits are accurate and they're working to make sure that food is produced safely. What we also want to do is deviate at different points from our HACCP plan. Deviate meaning go past the critical limits. The reason we want to do this is we want to make sure that once we deviate past our CCP, that our corrective action brings us back into the food safety plan. Okay? So we want to make sure that when there is a problem with the food processing, whether it's a temperature issue, a time issue, whatever it may be, that our SOP and our corrective action brings us back into a proper food safety plan. Okay? So that's a really important part, because if you spend all this time developing a HACCP plan and a food safety plan, but then don't actually check to make sure it works, you've actually wasted a lot of time designing a plan that doesn't really work. You might also find, once you design the plan, that perhaps a corrective action doesn't work, or you might find a different hazard that you didn't think about. So doing a validation check on your plan will often show you that it's working correctly, parts that are incorrect, or things that you may not have thought about in the beginning. So that's a very, very important step, is our HACCP validation. And then the final step to our HACCP plan is to create record-keeping procedures. And the record-keeping procedures are the logbooks or the documents that we create and we keep whenever we run through a system. So whenever we process chicken or cook chicken or cool chicken or whatever it is, we're making sure that we document the procedure and the temperatures and times that are related to that step. So for example, we have a cooling log, and I take the temperature of my sauce, then I cool it, I take the temperature of my sauce and how long it took to cool, and then I initial it, and that record is kept on file in case there's a future problem with a foodborne outbreak or foodborne illness outbreak. So that's a bit more in-depth in terms of how we go through a HACCP plan. Next week, we're going to go through on the whiteboard sort of step by step how to make a HACCP plan, how to effectively go through each step and determine what is a hazard, what isn't a hazard, how likely is it to be a hazard, how to set up critical control points, how to set critical limits, how to define your corrective actions. And again, most of this is all based on food safety and food science in terms of temperatures and times and safe handling procedures. So we won't really do a PowerPoint next week, but we'll do more of a hands-on physical framework of how to do a HACCP plan. At this point, you should have also read your final project outline, because that's up on your e-learning. So make sure that you read your final project outline, both for studying ingredients and also for hygiene and safety. And then if you have any questions, you can email me, or you can send a message on our Microsoft Teams. That way I can answer any questions that you might have about those projects. Okay? Make sure you do that. So this part of the PPT is a video link that you'll need to go to. So watch the video. It's a bit of a rehash of what I talked about today. Remember that in this course we use the food danger zone of 40 and 140, but in the US they've recently changed, but this is an older video, so it uses the temperature of 135, which we don't use. We use 140, so keep that in mind. But you'll need to watch this video as well. The link is in the PowerPoint, which is on your e-learning also. So make sure you check that out, and then that should be it. So when you're setting up a food safety plan, it requires a lot of steps. Now this can kind of present itself in two ways. One of the main things is that you need to go in a logical order, starting from your suppliers to your customers. If you deal with a supplier that has a HACCP plan already in place, that's one of the first steps, and we talked about this before in class. That's one of the first steps in having a HACCP plan, because then you have products are delivered to you and you have a good sense of these products are already contaminant free or they've been safely processed. So that's an incredibly important place to start with your supply chain. Now, the setting of a food safety plan can kind of come in two ways. You can start your own restaurant, your own company, and then you have to build your food safety plan from the ground up, meaning that there's nothing there. It's a clean slate. And this presents its own challenges and its own benefits. The other way to do it would be that you join a company or join a business and they already have a food safety plan running. Most often when you join a company that has a food safety plan in effect, it's a good idea because you have a fresh set of eyes. It's a good idea to run through their HACCP plan, run through their SOPs and corrective actions to ensure that their food safety plan is in fact effective. As science evolves and as knowledge of food safety evolves, things change. Things are updated, protocols are changed, temperatures are changed. So you have to make sure that their plan is still updated with the most current information and that it works. It's also a good idea to test the knowledge of the staff. When you join a location, check their food safety knowledge and see if they're knowledgeable in every aspect of HACCP and food safety. And if they're not, devise and set up a training schedule to get them more knowledgeable and more effective in their implementation or approach to food safety, because it's also a critical part of the business. So like I mentioned, there's really a logical way to design a food safety plan, and like I said, it usually revolves with starting at the receiving area, to your storage, to processing, and then following this chain. So this is the most logical way to go through a food safety plan, and as I mentioned, next week we're going to go through each sort of step or each process to determine at each stage how you determine what is and what isn't a food hazard, what is a critical control point, critical limit, and your corrective action, so you have a better idea of how to do this. Because your final project is related to a food safety plan, okay? Like I said, for each of the boxes or each of the steps, you need to determine the hazards, the CCPs, the corrective action, the monitoring, and then perform validation. Then you can start doing your record keeping. Typically, setting up a food safety plan involves a large committee or a group, members from the purchasing and receiving team, the culinary team, stewarding team, the F&B department. Quite often you might have a QS manager or HR manager or even the general manager might be involved in setting up a food safety plan. Together, this group will analyze the food flow to determine where the hazards are and what the controls could be, okay? And it's a lengthy process, but once it's up and running, it's a very smooth thing to maintain and update as needed. So next week, we're going to look at some various HACCP forms for you for online learning. I'll post them onto the e-learning, and you can take a look at them, and then I can explain them to you at a later date. But they're fairly self-explanatory. They're just some examples of how you design a food safety sheet. You will need to make your own for your final project in terms of your processing sheets for your fake food safety plan. You'll need to design and produce your own food safety forms, okay? And as I said, you should look at the e-learning and look at the PowerPoint on your final project because you'll need to do that. So just in case, we'll just run through this quickly, but again, you'll need to look at this on your own time so that you can develop some questions and then you can ask them. So your final project will be to make a mock-up or a fake food safety plan. The food safety plan should follow a selected menu, so you can go to a restaurant, pick a menu. The menu item that will be found, or a menu item will be found at a casual dining restaurant, pasta, hamburgers, etc., something like that. Nothing too complicated, nothing too complex. You need to outline which menu item you've chosen. Your project needs to include detailed recipes, including all ingredients in metric, meaning grams, kilograms, liters, milliliters, nothing else, used for the processing and production of the menu item. Missing items mean missing points. All items involved in the food production process must be listed and tracked from the time of receiving until the point of service to the guest. So all the ingredients that you're using in your recipes have to be tracked and monitored throughout the entire process from receiving to service. All processing steps also must be listed and displayed in the form of a food processing sheet, a cooling log, a reheating log, a cooking log, and a service log. Okay, whatever it may be. Do not make your food plan too easy. So for example, if you just choose an apple or a simple salad, that's going to be very, very easy, which means that you'll get a very, very basic mark. Your food plan should involve the following steps: food receiving, food processing, pre-cooked procedure, so if you have to pre-make a sauce or pre-make a garnish or pre-make a soup or a vegetable or a potato dish or a starch dish, and then your final cooking procedure. So all of the related steps and all the related processes used to make your food safety plan. Any processing step should also have a food processing data form. Missing steps equals missing points. Be sure to include details related to receiving and storage, such as which items are stored in the dry storage, the fridge and freezer. What area in the fridge are they stored? What's the receiving protocol? Any kind of SOP related to that. Your project should be in PowerPoint form, except for charts, graphs, etc. like that. There's no minimum or maximum in terms of the length of the project. And keep in mind, if the project is short, it probably means that you've done something very easy and you have not challenged yourself, which will also be reflected in your grade. If your project is very long, it could also mean that you are including details or data that's not so useful and not related, so keep that in mind. You have roughly 5 weeks to complete this project, so create a rough draft, let it sit, go back to it, look at it again, make some changes that you feel are needed. Don't wait too long before you start this project. You should have plenty of time now. I don't know if you've gotten your other final projects yet from your other courses, but now you have this one, so you can start in on it. If you are here in time to present your final project in class, great. If not, then you can send it to me via email. Okay? I'll double check your arrival dates and we'll coordinate with that as well. All right, so that's it. Make sure you check your e-learning and stay updated on all the material that we have. And if you have any questions, please make sure you ask via email or via our Microsoft Team group, which is often best because a question you have, another student might also have. So at least then they can see your question and the answer that you get. So with that being said, have a nice week, and we'll see you all at the next hygiene and safety class.